it takes courage to bring your fantasy to reality. If you think about it, it's why so many of our ideals and aspirations and our imaginations stay inside of us and stay in that realm of what's fantasy, because we have to summon up the courage within ourselves to see those impossible things come true. We think of being brokenhearted as something that is negative or dark and happens when we're down. But I just want you to think about that is, I was using those words, broke my heart open, because sometimes when we break something, it lets a little bit of light in, right? Fantasy involves the most human element in us, which is connection. And, you know, fantasy is so intimate. That's why I think it's so impactful when we share those fantasies with someone else. But again, it's also why it takes so much courage to put out there what those fantasies are. So today's topic is fantasy. I'm going to talk about my project, Literary Lots. And I'm not a PhD or expert. I haven't studied fantasy for like 10 or 15 or 20 years, even though I'm only 26. So this is more of like a lessons learned, you know, kind of like life talk. But I really didn't want to come unprepared. So for once in my life, I actually did type the speech out too, which I never do that. You know, but I was like, okay, you know, I've got to like, this is early, people are going to be late for work, and I haven't made this many people late for work in a long, long time. And so I was like, I better do just like a little bit of research before I kind of go into my talk. And so I did what everybody does. I talked to a fantasy expert, 8-year-old girls. And, you know, in full disclosure, this is my daughter. And I asked her, like, hey, Janan, can you help me? I'm giving this talk. It's really important. And, you know, it's on fantasy. And, you know, can you tell me what fantasy means? And, you know, do you know what it is? And, like, where I could find it? And she answered, well, I did know what fantasy was, and I had a lot of fantasies, but I don't now because we have to go to Taekwondo, and that's not even my reality. And there are some of you who know my daughter, and that is exactly how it happened. And so this kind of provided me like a little bit of insight for this conversation. And my first kind of reflection lesson is like, first of all, do not ask kids about fantasies when they have to go to practice and they want to play Legos. But the idea is that, you know, like reality can beat out fantasy a lot of days. And we just kind of need to be aware of that, get kind of grounded in that. So I decided to go to our modern Oracle of Delphi. It's called Google. And, you know, kind of ask, and I type in the word, you know, fantasy, and this is like what I get. In like 0.9 seconds, not even like 1 second, less than 1 second, I get 865 million results, the first 3 pages of which are fantasy football. And, you know, I had a fantasy team the last couple of years. I'm a modern girl. So, and I made the playoffs last year, so please, like, you know, but I got my lesson, second kind of lesson in fantasy, which was, again, you know, grounding for this conversation, which is some fantasies involve men in tight pants playing with balls. And, you know, you can take that however you want. So then I was like, man, I like got to sound smart at this, and I really should know what fantasy means. And so then I actually was like, oh, Google, fantasy definition or definition of fantasy, and I got this. And it was actually quite interesting to me. Because if you read this, and I searched, you know, a couple of the definitions, there's a key word here. It says the faculty or activity of imagining things, especially things that are impossible or improbable. And then I actually looked up the definition of dream. And what was really interesting is that the difference, and I'm not a linguist, but the difference between the definition of dream and fantasy hinges on this difference between what's possible, imagining something that's possible in a dream, Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have a fantasy, right? He said, I have a dream, an imagination of something that's possible, and a fantasy, which is something seemingly impossible or magical or otherworldly. And in this kind of quick comparison, I have a third lesson, which is that fantasy is an active endeavor, right? It takes work to imagine the impossible, the improbable, or the magical. And so I was like, okay, great, these are 3 good lessons. Like, this is good grounding research, totally unscientific. This is why I do not have a higher degree. But I do have a degree in journalism and urban master's in urban planning, and this is the work I do. I don't, a lot of stick figures and drawings and Post-its and colored dots. And I got a degree in journalism and then a master's in urban planning because I was thinking, like, telling stories wasn't enough. I really wanted to do something grounded in my communities. And I worked with governments and nonprofits like my entire career to help them be more effective, more efficient, more transparent. And I think now more than ever, that's needed. And I'm totally motivated in this work that we have to create civic institutions that are responsive to our communities. And that requires those institutions and those cultures to change within them. And so I do things like this, like I flow chart and I ask people who work on programs, like, really after the 5th time they fill out that form, you answer their question? Or do you think maybe we could try to make that easier for people? And I come up with things like this, which are sort of creative. They use a lot of Post-its and they're colorful, and I do draw stick figures in my job. So, that's kind of interesting. But in reflecting kind of about this work that I do, which is really embedded in kind of the bureaucracy of institutions, I came up with kind of a sad lesson, which is, I think my work may be fantasy, or my dream about my work may be fantasy, and if it's not, I may need magical powers to actually make these things happen. So a couple of years ago, as I was doing this work in these nonprofits and government agencies and really passionate about trying to get them to change, and other things in like my personal life, I was like, kind of thinking about other stuff in my life and my own fantasies and stuff, and we all have these fantasies, right? Like, that are not our job, and we have the banal fantasy, like that our kitchen is always clean and everything's in order, and like our totally unrealistic fantasy, like we could eat donuts all day, every meal. And I also just thought it was important that if we're talking about fantasy, we should also have a picture of donuts. I'm not really sure why, but I just thought they went together. And then, our dream boat fantasies. I have like nothing more to say here except, yeah, right? Like, be still my heart. I think I could just probably end this talk with this picture, and then we would be good. And again, you can interpret this and how it applies to me any way you want. So we all have these things, right? Besides the bureaucratic work and things that we do. And as I was writing this and thinking about it and thinking about these kind of fantasies at these different levels, I kind of had this other epiphany and lesson, which is that our fantasies are part of us. They make us who we are, and they reflect our needs and our hopes and our desires. And so, when I came up with this idea of literary lots, at the time, Cleveland a couple years ago, and still, there was so much conversation about changing the narrative around the emptiness, right? Changing the narrative around the empty space and the vacant lots, and reimagining them, and could we do things that were small, and now there's like a path in this empty space, and where does that path go, and gardens and these things like that. I thought about these vacant spaces and these empty spaces, and kind of my own work, which is why I brought it up. And I have 2 kids, and I'm always reading to them, and this is one of my most favorite books. How many people have read this book, Andrew Henry's Meadow? Oh my gosh, okay, so Amazon, well, you shouldn't buy from Amazon maybe now, because I know there's maybe a boycott on it or something, but go to your local bookstore or Apple Tree or somewhere else and buy this book. This book is Andrew Henry's Meadow, and it's actually one of my favorite books, and someday one of my fantasies is to write children's book. That would mean I'd have to like sit down and write and not eat donuts maybe, but I want to work on that. So Andrew Henry's Meadow is a story, and it's about a middle child. I am also a middle child, so I'm sure there's some resonance there. And Andrew Henry is always, he's a builder and he's an inventor. And he's always building stuff, and he's like annoying his mom and his dad because he built an eagle's cage in the living room, and he uses his sister's sewing machine. And so one day Andrew Henry picks up all his stuff, and he goes like through the town and like over the rocks and through the woods to this meadow. And he builds his house, and he builds his house there with a perfect ledge for dragonflies to land on. And in this meadow, all these 9 or 10 other kids come from the town, and they all have their little idiosyncrasies, little passion things that they love. One girl loves birds, and they can't have them, and boats and frogs and music, and so they come and they say, Andrew Henry, will you build this house for me? And he understands them, and he builds houses that reflect their passion. And I love the story because it's about having passion for what you do, but also supporting, others and building a community. And the image in the story, and I think it's literally kind of right in the middle, when you open this book, this meadow that was once empty is filled then with these 9 or 10 houses that reflect the kids that were there. And I thought oh my gosh, we have all this vacant space in Cleveland. We should have Andrew Henry's Meadow there. And all these kids could come and play and be themselves. And that would be awesome. And I want a house there too with a perfect ledge for dragonflies to land on. And so I was like, wait, I can make this happen. And so I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we did this? And I talked with this artist, Julia Kuo, who many of you know. She's done a lot of work. She had a blog, I think, called 100 Days in Cleveland, where she did an illustration of all of these beautiful things, and I was so moved by her art. And so I contacted her, and I said, I have this idea where, what if you walked down the street, and there were, truffula trees from Dr. Seuss, or, Moby Dick, or, and she's, sat there, and if you know Julia, she listens really well. She's quiet. She's like, yeah, that sounds awesome. I was like, okay, awesome, let's do this. And so I kind of presented this idea, and she conceptualized, and this is kind of her branding of the project, about this idea that you open this book and all of those things that are in it kind of come out. And so with this, I asked my friend Alice Butts, who's on the library board, hey, do you think you could maybe help me get a meeting with Felton Thomas, the library director? And she's like, yeah, sure. And I was like, oh, okay, great. So now it wasn't just an idea. I was like, oh, I have something on paper. I have this very pretty picture. That's really good. And I go in, and I kind of asked the impossible, and I said, I have this idea, with a story, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and stuff. And how about we have these 8-foot sandwich boats and vacant lots, and people can read outside all day, and maybe a giant meatball and tea parties and then there's a little bit of silence, and I'm getting this little bit of, And if you know Felton Thomas, how many people have seen or know Felton? Yeah. Okay, so he's awesome, right? So he's kind of cool, calm, quiet guy, and so he's listening, and he says to me yeah, that sounds cool. It goes well with our strategic plan and engagement, and we can try this. We can't really lead it, but we'll support you in doing this. And so it kind of led me to this lesson, is that it takes courage to bring your fantasy to reality. It takes a lot to ask somebody to build 8-foot sandwich boats and giant meatballs in a vacant lot. And honestly, when I was writing this and thinking about this is really so important, And if you think about it, it's why so many of our ideals and aspirations and our imaginations stay inside of us and stay in that realm of what's fantasy, because we have to summon up the courage within ourselves to see those impossible things come true. And so it requires a deep reflection and a deep confidence in that impossible to be able to vocalize it and take it somewhere else. And that's not easy. And for me, I wasn't working at any Cleveland institution. I'm just a solo entrepreneur running my own thing. And to not be attached to something and go to the library director and ask this was, it was a lot. And so we did this. We did this work, and it looked like this, and as we were building it, people were like, what's going on there? And people would be walking by, and they had this sense of awe and inspiration. And I did a Kickstarter campaign, and I raised $50,000 with amazing support from my friend Pam McKee, who I think was going to be here, she might not be here, and Tracy Martin, who is Director of Development at the library, and Frank Nichols, who is a friend of mine in Chicago. He worked with me for 6 years, and honestly, I can't really do anything without Frank. He's amazing. And Fraser Contracting, JT Fraser, built all of these pieces that kind of came out from my ideas and picking pieces from the storybooks and Julia's rendering. And, this was done in Ohio City. It wasn't the most vacant lot in the most underserved area. But, sometimes you have to adjust your fantasy to reality. And in this particular place that was really under-programmed and underutilized, the librarians there, Angela and Helen, they're amazingly supportive of this project and advocates for it. And, so I did. I got 3 8-foot sandwich boats outside. And there are other parts of this. The idea of literary lots is to kind of create a variety of spaces from storybooks that, families and especially kids can go in and realize and have that sense of wonder. And we did this mural the first year, which is about stone soup. And, how many know the story of stone soup? Yeah, some of you, almost all of you, right? And the idea is that collectively, you can make soup for everyone, right? That everyone has something to offer and to contribute, and that what was needed in this community that was so hungry, right? This community that really was like, we're hungry, we're starving, we don't have anything, they needed someone to kind of collectively activate that, right? The man who brought the pot and just said like, oh, give me a pot. Actually, he didn't even have one, right? He's like, oh, someone said I have a pot, and then he put a stone in, and then people asked like, what are you doing? And then they brought their carrots and their radishes and things, and then they had enough for everyone. And so this idea of literary lots was, and still is, because I'm so willing to do it again, is about the activation and providing a safe space to use your imagination, that, collectively that it's there. And then we had the space about Alice in Wonderland and the tea party and these giant flowers. And it was really great because tiny kids and older kids and parents and boys, I actually have a couple really good pictures of little boys having, a tea party. They were actually serving girls, which is the way it should be. And, it was pretty awesome. And let's be real, like all of us want to be a guest at the Mad Hatter's tea party, right? Like we all want to be at that tea party. So, it was, again, kind of activating different pieces, taking different pieces of books and putting them there, making that idea, that imagined space a little bit more real. And this is kind of the whole lot, and you'll see the giant meatball and some of the spaghetti tubes and the sandwich boats, and at the far end, the tea party. And what's amazing to me is that quotation that I put up there with me talking to Felton Thomas, where I literally said, like, hey, I want to have 8-foot sandwich boats and people reading outside all day. Well, it happened. And how many of you actually went to any or of the literary lots? Like some of you, yeah. So it actually happened that we had these boats out there and we had books on them and we had books on the tea party tables and people read to each other and people read the books that were there. And I had people who would, parents who were there and kids who would walk in without their parents or, kind of like be away from their parents, and they'd walk to somebody else and say like, hey, could you read me this book? And no one said no. That adult read that book, or that kid read the book to somebody else. And sometimes kids would ask me like, can I take this book home? And I would say, yeah, no problem. And then they would take those books and I would get other books and replenish the stock. And so, this idea about it is amazing, because reading and literature and fantasy in these books, they provide a connection, and that's so, so important. And thinking about reflecting after I did it the first year, I realized that sharing your fantasies with others can make them come to life in ways you can't imagine. And it's that idea that, everyone can add something that's even maybe a little bit more magical. And so this effort of like getting it out of my head and my heart and putting it on a paper with Julia and asking really made, and then other people building it and other people helping me raise money for it, like made this fantasy their own, right? Like it became their own. And after that lot closed down the first year, sometimes I'd be walking to the West Side Market or wherever, and kids would ask me like, hey lady, are you like gonna do that thing again with the boats, or like when are we gonna like have it, or I have an idea. And so like this thing that was inside of me that was inspired by work other people were doing on vacant lots, and Andrew Henry's Meadow, that book that I have carried for my whole life since I was 6 years old, now we're part of other people's reality. And one day I was walking with my son, kind of like the lot was still open, and my sister visited, and we were just like taking a walk to get ice cream. And he said, like, hey, Literary Lots is closing. And if you know my son, he's very like logical and practical. I said, babe, I don't know, like it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of money, and I'm a little tired. And he's like, oh yeah, I know. It's okay. And then he said, but like people really like it, and it's good for the neighborhood, and well, I don't know, like maybe we could help and do it again. And well, gosh darn it, that just broke my heart open a little bit more. And I couldn't say no. And when I promised my kids things, I tried to make those promises come true. Like, we gotta go to China. Australia, Egypt, Argentina, Amsterdam, and Paris. But I use these words very purposefully. Like, when I say that he broke my heart open just a little bit more and I couldn't say no, we think of being brokenhearted as something that is negative or dark and happens when we're down. But I just want you to think about that is, I was using those words, broke my heart open, because sometimes when we break something, it lets a little bit of light in, right? When we take it apart, things that are closed, or we were closed to the idea of doing it again. I was kind of closed, like, oh man, that took like a lot. I gotta close up. And when you broke it open, just that little bit more kind of lets the light back in. And well, if you can kind of put yourself in my shoes and be like, dude, that's like a lot to go and ask for 8-foot sandwich boats. What's she gonna do now? Well, if you already ask for 3 8-foot sandwich boats, then only next thing you can do is ask for a 12-foot squid. Because, who does not want now a 12-foot giant squid in the middle of their lot? And if that's not enough, you have to ask for a submarine that then kids can go in and play in. And I just want to put a shout out here, and the submarine was awesome, and it was great, and kids would read in it, and there's benches in it, and they could sit and read, and Find a Way World gave me audiobooks, and so kids would sit in there and like listen to the audiobooks. And Kelly Little, if anyone knows him, man, he was at Find a Way World, and he really supported this project a lot, and it was amazing. And there was a lot of success in this project. I had over 1,000 different people come to each literary lot in 2 weeks. And 1,000 different people, that's like a lot. That doesn't count the people like Martha, my friend here, who came many, many days, and other people in the neighborhood who would like make it part of their morning routine. And so, I think that this project resonates with so many people because we all have like that favorite book, right? We have that favorite story. We have something that we take with us from when we're 6 to 16 to 26, and that's where I stop. But if you're 36 or 46 and you go on, and we have that idea like, man, what if I could walk into that book, right? Like we even talk about reading as an escape and a fantasy, right? Like we want to go into that world. And so I think that this project resonates with so many people because of that. And so I went in bringing literary lots to life the first year and the second year from 8-foot sandwich boats to 12-foot squids, and it gave me this lesson number 8, which is you can always have a bigger, more impossible, more magical fantasy. There's always something just there. So this picture is literally at the edge of the world. It's the Pacific Northwest, and if you know me and you read anything that I've written, like I love the Pacific Ocean. Like it's my heart place, the Pacific. And I love to travel, and it's a part of traveling and being different places, is part of my fantasy. And I thought about this, that a lot of people have that fantasy, right? Like of going away and going to the edge of the world or going to space. And sometimes people think like, oh, that's like to get away, Like that's the fantasy, that's to escape and go. And I kind of propose a different question, which is that even here at the edge of the world, even here when you go, and even here if this is a place that you imagine you need to go to kind of find yourself or be yourself, that this fantasy of going here, of going to that edge, is really not to actually get away, but it's actually to connect. that going to this edge, wherever that edge is, if it's this physical place at the end of the world, if it's writing that children's book that's on your desk, if it's, talking to that pretty girl that you really like that you haven't, or that really great guy that you haven't, that those things are calling us to kind of connect with those things that are most intimate with us, that's that calling that we have to make that connection to ourself and other. And so this lesson 9, which is that fantasy involves the most human element in us, which is connection. And fantasy is so intimate, and that's why it's so meaningful, and that's why I think it's so impactful when we share those fantasies with someone else. But again, it's also why it takes so much courage to put out there what those fantasies are. And normally I will end this kind of conversation like this, and it would be good. But I would be remiss if I didn't add an important footnote at this time. And I'm not going to end on a downer, but I'm going to go down just a second. And I just need maybe a minute to get my own composure to say. So this is from Wednesday, but it's kind of been conversation. Trump team is mulling Muslim registry and planning a border wall and things like that. And I just want to put this out here, like, just so you know, like, I am this person. You know, when you read these things or your friends read these things, they're talking about putting me and my kids on this list. Okay? So if you want to know, like, who's going to be on that list, you can just absorb for a second, because that's me. And it doesn't matter, it's not just about the Muslims, it's about the wall, it's about the immigrants, it's about attacking our very earth and nature, and those things that are fundamentally us. We are really just clay and mud and stardust, right? And so this is the narrative that is emerging. And I just want to say that these ideas are someone's fantasy. And I use the word fantasy and not reality, and I distinguish it from dream purposely. Because as I said earlier, when I looked up the definition, dream was to make something possible. Martin Luther King had a dream, right? Not a fantasy, that those things were going to be real. And I'm using the word here on fantasy, again, on purpose, because in America you can't do these things. These are someone's fantasies. And to bring them to light, to make these fantasies a reality, is to change the very nature of what this country is, which is about inclusion and diversity. And we have to work so hard. We have to summon up this courage to make sure that this is not the dominant narrative. And it comes to my lesson then in reflection, which is that some people's fantasies are other people's nightmares. And that the difference between dream and fantasy and nightmare is like, it's a very thin gray line. And it's not set. And these things are really, really fluid, right? And I believe that these fantasies that become nightmares are driven by darkness, right? They come from a place of hate and anger and fear. And when we are afraid, we do not act in our own best interests. And for sure, when we are afraid, we cannot connect. And if we cannot connect, we cannot be our most human, most intimate selves. And fantasies that are light, that cause our heart to skip a bit, that idea of like, I walk by and I see sandwich boats and I'm in awe for a second, you know? I see a 12-foot squid and it takes my breath away for just a minute. That those fantasies cause that emotion because they're intimate and they intimately connect with who we are as human beings. And so the human imagination is an amazing thing, and we have to nurture it, and we have to remember that, because the question between this dark fantasy and this light fantasy just hinges on this practice of what is it that we're going to harness. How are we going to harness our imagination individually and collectively? Because that's all that edge is between them. And so I want to just end with Alice in Wonderland, which is one of our most fantastical stories. And Alice laughed and she said, "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was younger, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." So what I'm asking you kind of in the final lesson, and really it's not a final lesson, but to kind of take that conversation between Alice and the Queen to heart, is that it takes practice to believe the impossible. And we need to believe the impossible right now. I'm not asking, actually, like, I'm begging. I am asking, totally open and vulnerable to all of you that are here, considering where we are, like, I need you. You know, my children right now need you. You know, my family and my friends need you. Like, we all need you to keep on imagining the impossible. So, especially now. So, I hope you all have a really awesome day. You all have on your pins and name tags, you know, how you're going to make this world more creative. I asked Thomas to make sure that those weren't throwaway, but they were paper, so you could use it as a bookmark, or you could use it as a, you know, put it in your wallet. Please fill it in about how you're going to make this world more creative. And then, like the Queen says, practice, practice, practice. Maybe you can think of one impossible thing before breakfast, or at breakfast, or 5 or 10 or 15, and whatever that impossible thing is, share it. And then share it again and share it again, because whatever that is, I need, and my family needs, and my kids need, and your community needs. So please practice the impossible, because it is the only way that we can change the narrative and make the change and make those impossibilities real, so we can imagine whatever's next.